Great. This morning, we are pleased to be joined by Jonathan Zimmerman, an author and the Judy and Howard Berkowitz Professor in Education at Penn's Graduate School of Education. Professor Zimmerman is one of the foremost education historians working today. His work examines how education practices and policies have developed over time and the myths that often cloud our understanding of teaching and learning. The professor's talk today is titled, From Religion to History, How Our Culture Wars Have Changed. Professor.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks to all of you for coming out or coming in on a rainy Sunday morning. I'm really delighted to have this opportunity. I've always been a huge fan of your society and what you do. So thanks for hosting this. I'm going to try to make this not a total downer, even though in many ways it is. I'll briefly tell you what I think the bad news is about what's happening to our schools right now. And then to the point of the title of the talk, I'll tell you what I think is new about them, which is that we're arguing really about nation rather than about religion. And so I don't conclude on a total downer note. I'll also suggest that this moment could present some great opportunities for our democracy if we have the courage to seize them. And I'll try to keep my remarks as short as possible because, as always, I'm vastly more interested in hearing what you have to say than the sound of my own voice. So the bad news I'm going to keep briefly because you know what it is. Just in 2002, 36 states introduced 137 pieces of legislation to limit what schools and teachers can teach. Especially around the areas of race and sexuality. The most famous or infamous, of course, is Florida's Don't Say Gay law. But again, there are over 100 similar laws. Penn America calls them education gag laws because that's what they are. So, Oklahoma bars lessons that make anyone feel, quote, guilt or anguish on account of race. And, if you read what's going on in Oklahoma, you read teachers saying like, well, then I don't think I can teach about the Tulsa Race Massacre because somebody might feel guilt or anguish about it. And, from where I stand, if you don't feel some sort of anguish about the Tulsa Race Massacre, you might be a sociopath. But the guilt and anguish part is fascinating because, of course, it's also brought to us by the same party that keeps complaining about cancel culture in higher education. And censorship happening, to protect snowflakes' feelings. Well, what could be a more naked example of cancel culture than what's going on in our state legislatures right now? In book bans, also at the local level, Ruby Bridges, Mouse, Toni Morrison's Beloved. I should tell you this latest wave has been highly partisan. Of the 137 bills I could count, 136 of them were sponsored by one political party, and it wasn't mine. It was the Republican Party. And yet, if you think about the idea of speech as harm and the need to protect people from harm, I also think it's worth noting that my party and more broadly people on the American left, that they've played a role in this as well that I don't think has been discussed enough. So just to be as clear and obvious as possible, if like me you were outraged by the removal of Toni Morrison's Beloved from the schools of Loudoun County, Virginia, how can you stand by when Huck Finn gets removed? Can you make an argument that we should retain Beloved but cancel Huck Finn? I'd be interested in hearing it. I've never heard a good one. A lot of that was justified in exactly the same idiom as these Republican laws. Like people are going to feel badly, it's going to offend them, it's going to harm them, it's going to hurt them, make them afraid, and so on, which is what censors say at all times, right? And in every place. So what's new about all this? In order to answer that question, I have to just tell you a story about a book that I wrote and then rewrote, because that really answers the question. So in 2002, I wrote a book called Who's America? Culture Wars in the Public Schools, which was about the way we've argued about history and religion. And at the time, and note I said at the time because it was 2 decades ago, what I argued was that the history wars had the wrong solution and the religion wars had no solution. And I'll just explain each of those. The history wars had the wrong solution because what I argued in that book was whenever there was a conflict in the United States over history, the way we solved it, putting that in quotes, was by adding new peoples and new faces to the old story. When I was a kid, I was born in 1961, the textbooks were almost entirely about white men. If anybody tells you that that's what they are now, they just haven't looked at one, it's false, right? I mean, this is why the textbooks are like 800 pages long, right? Because they try to include everybody. And if you want to know about Kazaki American heroes and heroines, there's like a sidebar about them, right? You name it, right? Everyone's included, which is great. That's how it should be. And yet, the title of the textbook typically remains the same. Rise of the American Nation, Quest for Liberty. Have you ever noticed that the chemistry textbook is not called Triumph of the Atom? Rise of the Periodic Table? No, that's not how it works. It's only in history that it works that way. And I tried to tell some stories in my first edition about why I think that came about. And there were some surprises in there as well. So, basically I had gone to grad school in the 80s and early 90s. And in grad school, you learn that everything in history is debate. It's not that all stories are created equal, because they're not, but we don't know everything. And the way that we learn more is actually by arguing over competing stories. So what I wanted to know was, why didn't these competing stories, or really anything very critical, appear in history textbooks, even as they got more diverse? Why were they so kind of uniform and bland in their interpretations? Just to take one very obvious example, in the early 20th century, the so-called progressive era, that's really the birth of modern history. And you may have heard the name Charles Beard. Charles Beard wrote a book in 1911 called The Economic Interpretation of the Constitution, in which Beard looked at the stock portfolios of the 55 framers that met in downtown Philadelphia. And what he argued was that many of them owned securities under the failed governments of the Articles of Confederation. So it was in their economic interest to forge a, quote, more perfect union. Now, I don't want to go into the weeds on that. Obviously, many other people have taken issue with that. I'm just giving you an example of the kind of critical interpretation that was in the air, right? That professional historians were grappling with. So why don't you see that discussion in any textbook? Well, to answer that question, I went looking for the usual suspects. That is, the people that, as a liberal historian, you're taught to suspect. The American Legion, the Veterans of Foreign War, Sons and Daughters of the American Revolution, because I figured it would be those people, namely, right-wing white Protestants that would have, joined to keep those interpretations out of textbooks. And I found a little of that, but only a little. What I mostly found, who kept these sort of critical interpretations out of textbooks? German Americans, Polish Americans, Italian Americans, Jewish Americans, African Americans. Now, why? Here's why. All those people, and many other immigrant and minority groups, are trying to read themselves into the American story. And one of the ways they do that is by celebrating their contributors to the American story, especially the American Revolution. So you've probably heard the name Thaddeus Kosciuszko. There's a bridge connecting Brooklyn and Queens named after him, and also one on Route 87 north of Albany. And Thaddeus Kosciuszko is this rich Polish guy that helped us in the revolution. Well, in the 1920s in Chicago, Kosciuszko Day, 250,000 people came out. It's a thing, and I mean a huge thing. So from the point of view of Polish Americans, to continue with this example, if you start to suggest that the revolution wasn't all that, then you're saying Kosciuszko wasn't all that, right? They don't want to mess in any way with the grand national story, because if you do that from their point of view, you're going to be messing with their contribution to it. And so, Irish Americans had Richard Montgomery, right? German Americans had DeKalb, and they said Molly Pitcher. They said she was born Maria Ludwig. There's a little debate about that. Jews, of course, Haim Solomon, who was a merchant here in Philadelphia, who helped finance the revolution. And of course, African Americans with Crispus Attucks, right, who we think was the first African American to perish in the revolution, in the Boston Massacre. So it isn't just like right-wing, racist white people, all right, that are trying to keep these critical interpretations out of the textbooks. It's everyone. Everyone's got skin in the game. And so the compromise that we make, the compromise that we strike, is that we just add more and more groups to the same story without really questioning it. And by the way, the adding more groups, I celebrate that, right? That is small d democratic. Those groups should be there. But what we didn't do, I argued in 2002, is we didn't ask what happens to the big story when we start to think about the experiences of all those other groups. So that was the history story in 2002. The religion story was also a surprise because I went into the research thinking that I would kind of trace the battle between liberals and conservatives or fundamentalists and modernists over whether to teach religion in school. That turned out to be the wrong question. Because before the 1960s, almost everyone wanted religion taught in schools. They just wanted different things taught about it. They wanted different religions. So what we had in the United States, really until the 60s, in thousands of schools, was something called weekday religious education, which if you're a senior, you might remember, because on Wednesdays at 2 p.m., I've never figured out why, you could be dismissed from class, and before 1948, sent to a different part of the building. After 1948, when the court altered the rules a little bit, you had to leave the building, and you received religious instruction from the religion of your choice. The way they tried to get around the, kind of the establishment clause, you can't fund religion things, is those classes had to be paid for by the church or, sometimes synagogue that did this. Incidentally, Jews were very divided on this question. There were some Jews that thought that we, and I say we because I'm Jewish, should have nothing to do with this project. But others said, no, we should because the Christians are doing it. And also it will be a way to teach more young Jews about Judaism. The Talmud Torah people didn't like it because they thought it was competing with them, like the people that actually ran the kind of after school things that I went to. Anyway, of course, most people are Christians, especially then. Most people in America are Christians now, but even more so then. And the real battle is between different Christians. So weekday religious education was actually pioneered by left-wing Americans, by progressives, because they wanted to use the Bible to teach the evil of racism and war and so on. So I'll just give you one quote, just a flavor. This is a North Carolina Bible teacher in 1948. Upon us rests the responsibility of presenting the Prince of Peace. Remember, this is 48, it's right after the Second World War. If we fail, we leave students surrounded by the hardness and cruelty of war that breeds hate, lost in the inequalities of an economic system that begets servants of mammon, slaves within the mental stockades of racial justice. We cannot fail, we must not fail. Ours is a holy task. This is somebody who wants religion in schools. Now, not everybody wants that version of Protestantism in schools, because obviously in the 1950s, think about the era of Billy Graham and the great revivals. There is an enormous revival of evangelical Christianity in this country. They also are getting in on the WRE, Weekday Religious Education Act, but they want to teach a very different version of Christianity. So the very same year, I found another article by United Evangelical Action about weekday religious education. It says religious education on release time from public schools may be one of the greatest means of evangelism for the coming generation, or it may be the most destructive to faith that can be imagined. If there is religious education, the question of the origin of the race, the deity of Christ, the infallibility of the Bible cannot be avoided. So-called Protestantism is divided into two entirely and irrevocably diverse groups. We need to push our own system of Christian instruction upon the schools now. So that person is a white Protestant too, right? Also wants to teach religion in schools, but a very different version. This is John 3:16. So if you, in Shea Stadium, I refuse to call it Citi Field, but when I was a kid in Shea Stadium, if you went to a Mets game, there was this one dude who had a season ticket and he held up this sign. Some of you are old enough, you remember John 3:16. And that's the one that just says like, in me you have life and without me, it does not end well, friends, right? And that's a very different idea. It's not like this social gospel, Jesus is a member of the British Labour Party, the loaves and fishes are a metaphor for, whatever, social redistribution. No, none of that stuff. It's like, get Christ, get to heaven, don't get Christ, go to hell. And so that was really the battle. Again, not whether to teach religion, but which religion to teach. It's also interesting to note that the first 10 Commandments laws were that is, laws to post the 10 Commandments in schools, proposed by pacifists during the First World War, some of whom were jailed under the Sedition Acts. Yeah. Right? Because the first one says, thou shalt not kill. See, we now live in an environment where if somebody wants religion in schools, you can rest assured they're going to be somewhere on the conservative side of the political spectrum, right? But that's of our own making and our own times. How does it come about? Well, in the early 60s, the Supreme Court does change the score. And they say in 2 consecutive decisions, 62 and 63, not that you can't pray in schools, never said that. They said teacher can't lead kids in a prayer. Very important. Not that you can't read the Bible in schools, never said that. Said teacher can't lead kids in the sacrament from the Bible. Those are important distinctions that we always lose sight of. You know, I'm on the radio sometimes about this subject, and somebody will call in and say, and then the court said you can't pray in schools. That's bullshit, right? The court has never said that, never could, never would, right? What the court said is that the school can't engage the kids in a sectarian prayer. If you want to have your moment of silence, you can do it, right? Trust me, when I was a kid, mine were more profane than sacred, right? But everyone is free to pray. It's just the school can't sponsor a prayer. So that changed the political complexion of all of this because basically American liberals took themselves out of that game because they didn't want to erode the court's authority on race. So, you know, Martin Luther King was getting arrested actually at one point, you know, he used to pray when he was getting arrested. When one of these decisions came down and somebody said, what do you think of it? And he said, we need to support the court because the court is all we have. It was a pretty tepid endorsement when you think about it, but it's an instrumental one, right? And he wasn't wrong about that, right? I mean, obviously, right, the court is to a degree protecting African-American rights at a very tenuous time in the history of the country. And liberals don't want to mess with that in any way. However, when surveys were done of African Americans, most African Americans opposed the prayer and Bible decisions and wanted prayer and Bible to continue in public schools for some pretty understandable reasons. I mean, the civil rights movement was a religious movement. Incidentally, a couple of years ago, I asked a group of undergrads what Martin Luther King's profession was. The poll position, the leading position was lawyer, but my favorite answer was policy expert. I just love that. You know, it's like, I have a dream, friends, that one day, thanks to the earned income tax credit, you know, the poverty rate will decline 0.2%. Yeah. No, like he was a minister and the civil rights movement was based in the church. So it makes complete sense. And so, you know, what I ended up concluding at the time, this is 2002, was again, the history wars are the wrong solution, and the religion wars didn't really have one. Like, look, either he was the son of man or he wasn't. Either human beings share DNA with other creatures or they don't. Either sexual activity and behavior is immoral outside of straight marriage or it isn't. And I didn't see any compromise between those two things. So I just imagined that the religion wars were always going to be with us. And the history wars, again, had the wrong solution. Well, I just wrote a 20th anniversary edition of the book. And it was quite on a personal level, it was kind of poignant. You know, the first edition was dedicated to my daughters, who at the time were 9 and 6. And the second edition is also dedicated to my daughters, and they're 29 and 26, and yet I'm the same age. It's a paradox. I don't know how all of this happened. But let me just say, friends, be careful what you wish for, okay? Because the reason I wrote it, honestly, is that I think in the 2 decades in the interim, everything changed. Basically, I think the religion wars, at least with respect to schools, radically cooled. And the history wars are all around us, and we have no way right now of solving them. Be careful what you wish for. I think the basic narrative is on the table. I really do, in ways that it never has been before. It's just we don't have the will, or I think the culture, to really engage that debate. So I'll just take those two things separately. The religion war is cooling. I mean, When was the last time you read about a big battle in a local school district over evolution and creation? I should tell you those battles still do happen now and again. They're in my book, but in a very minor key. Sex ed, radically less contested. And even when it is, and matters of sexuality are contested, rarely in a religious idiom. So I went and read, a lot about the Don't Say Gay bill, the Florida one. Almost no religious rhetoric in it whatsoever. So in earlier eras, you would have heard people say, well, you can't teach about that subject because it's a sin before God. I think a lot of people on the right have recognized, by the way, that that's just not a winning argument. Like a good way to persuade people is not to call them heathens, But I think the big change, and the one we're just too close to really appreciate, is our country has just gotten radically less religious. Like, we're not Europe yet, but we are moving in that direction. So in the past 20 years, the same 20 years, by the way, right, between my two editions, we think that both church affiliation or, mosque temple affiliation and weekly attendance went down 20% in 20 years. I think this is, if you're a historian, you waste a lot of time imagining how your own eras are going to be remembered, like what's going to be sort of the dominant theme. I think this will be an absolutely dominant development, right? And now we get to the be careful what you wish for thing. I also think that a lot of us who were hoping for that development now have to eat a huge amount of crow. Because the story that we liberals told about this subject was that as the country secularized, it would become more tolerant and more cosmopolitan and more comfortable with differences of every kind. I think the last 20 years are just thesis disproven. I think we were just wrong. We were right that the country would become more secular and less religious, but we were wrong that that would promote tolerance. In every way we can measure, Americans are less tolerant of each other, radically more polarized, radically less willing to sit down and talk to people that are different from themselves. I would go even farther, and here I borrow from this guy, Shamid Hamdi, whose work you may have seen in The Atlantic. I go even farther following Hamdi. I would say that we did get less religious, unless you start to think about red and blue as religions, which they kind of are. And we got radically more religious in that way. So, our political identities in some ways have now substituted for our religious identities, I think, or increasingly so. And I think the larger point is we believe them like religions, and something else that happened, I think, that's very important if you're just talking about the educational realm, beyond kind of secularization, is that the most orthodox believers, mainly Christians, exempted themselves from the public schools in huge numbers, either by starting these Christian academies or via homeschooling, which I think is the most important thing in American education that we talk and know the least about. And that's just because people that study education don't homeschool their kids, right? Which is a stupid reason, right? There are 100 books about charter schools for every one about homeschooling, right? And we think there are about the same number of people in charters and homeschools. It's just personal bias, right? People like me, we patronize charter schools. We don't homeschool our kids. But that's super important for this discussion, because what it means is that people who in prior eras would have been participating in the public school system and obviously putting pressure on it have just exempted themselves. So what that means is, all right, we're less religious, but we're more polarized. And now we're faced at a moment where, yes, the grand narrative is under contest. Let me be really clear. I don't agree with anything that most Republicans say about the 1619 Project, except for one thing. When they say that it represents a very sharp rejection of traditional stories that have been told about the American past and the meaning of America, I think the Republicans are right. I just think it's a good challenge. But I don't think it behooves any of us to pretend otherwise, right? Just look at the name of it. Of course it's a challenge. It's not Quest for Liberty, Rise of the American Nation. It's that we are not rooted in slavery. The dominant fact is that we are rooted in we're not, that was an interesting slip. We're not rooted in freedom and liberty. The dominant fact, according to the 1619 Project, is that we're rooted in slavery and native extinction / removal. That is a fundamental challenge, definitely, definitely. I think the only question is, what do we do with it, right? If you want to know my answer, if I were king, and we don't have enough time this morning to enumerate all the reasons that's not going to happen, but every high school teacher would just give the students the 1619 Project and the state-approved textbook. It would just be, okay, like, let's start with Columbus. What does 1619 say? What does the textbook say? Let's do the American Revolution, 1619 textbook, and on and on. And by the way, there are small numbers of teachers that actually do that, but they're very small. And the reason is, we don't want it. How many people want that? Seriously, on any side. When was the last time you saw a protest by an interest group called People for Debating the Other Side in schools? Right? More nuance, more dialogue. Never seen that. That happens to be what I want, but who am I? Right? I think a lot of people on the right wouldn't want that, but I think the left wouldn't either, including advocates of the 1619 Project. So here's an Arizona educator after her school district adopted materials from 1619. And just listen carefully to the words here. If you want to create a better society of young people and problem solvers, they have to understand and know America's truth and what it was built on. So we begin with a nod to problem solving, and then we solve the problem for them. America's truth. That's it. If we want problem solvers, we need people that have my truth. That's not going to solve any problem, right? That's just substituting one truth for another. In Buffalo, actually, one of the superintendents I found said that any teacher who wanted to question the 1619 Project would need permission beforehand, and that liberal critics of the 1619 Project, and there are many, all right, the 1619 Project isn't gospel, it's a historical interpretation. Liberal critics of it are just another form of oppression. So again, who wants this? Who actually wants this? And that question was driven home to me, and I'm going to be quiet very soon, by this amazing exchange that I found from 1962 between Richard Rorty and his father James Rorty. Now, I'm sure there's some people on this call that recognize the name of Richard Rorty, because Dick Rorty was arguably the most important philosopher, American-born philosopher of post-war America. He was very young at this time. He had just gotten his PhD. And he has an exchange, one of these printed debates with his dad, James Rorty, about the idea of teaching about communism. This is 1962. We're still in the Cold War. And some Cold Warriors had been pleading for American schools to teach about communism, especially its dangers, because we have to know the evils of the bad guys. And James Rorty was one of them. James Rorty had been a communist in his youth in the 1930s. And, he morphed into this very hard-edged Cold Warrior, which is not an uncommon pattern. Think about a figure like Whittaker Chambers. I mean, it's the same thing, right? And so he writes about how we need to teach everybody about the evils of communism. And Dick Rorty, his response is, we can't, at least not honestly. And this is what he says. Can we subject our nation to critical analysis in our schools? No, we cannot. If schools were to teach about communism in an objective way, they'd have to concede that the Soviet Union has made huge technological achievements and that much of the world's wealth is stolen from the poor by the rich, exactly as communists say. But our schools cannot and will not do that. It is impossible for the public schools of a democratic country to educate youth in areas in which education would call into question beliefs which are central to the general tenor of adult opinion. This fact is one of the built-in disadvantages of democracy, part of the price paid for its advantages. What Dick Gordy was saying was that the Jonathan Zimmermans of the world are basically urinating into the wind, okay? They think that we can have these debates in our schools, They call that democratic education with a small d. But what if the demos doesn't want it? Is it even democratic then? Is it even possible? I want it. But one of the things I've realized is that I've spent my career trying to persuade more people to want it, and I've failed. I'm still going to keep trying, right? But people like me have failed. We have not convinced enough members of the demos that democratic education would be a good thing for us and for our kids. So I do want to end on an optimistic note. First of all, there are teachers who are doing this. I know I had them. You probably did too. I think we need to know much more about them. In my newspaper columns, I've tried to highlight them as best I can. And I also think we do need to celebrate the fact that the big questions are on the table. Like I said, I don't think we have good ways of answering them in our schools. In fact, I don't think there's enough sentiment to even address them. But it's great that they're there. And, you know, for me, what's wonderful about this moment is captured by a poem that that appears at the very end of my book by an African-American poetess from South Carolina named Nikki Finney, who was kind enough to let me reproduce it in the book. And it's called A New Day Dawns. And Nikki Finney wrote this poem right after the South Carolina legislature decided to remove the Confederate flag from its state house in 2015, which was, of course, itself in response to the murders at the African-American Episcopal Church there, right, by a white supremacist. And it's called A New Day Dawns, and this is what she says. She says, "It is the pearl blue peep of day. All night the palmetto sky was seized with the aurora and alchemy of the remarkable. A blazing canopy of newly minted light fluttered in while we slept. We are not free to go on as if nothing happened yesterday. Not free to celebrate as if all our prayers have finally been answered. We are free only to search the yonder of each other's faces as we pass by, tip our hat, hold the door ajar, asking silently, who are we now? Soon it will be just us, again alone beneath the swirling indigo sky of South Carolina. Alone and working on the answer to our great day's question, who are we now? What new human cosmos can be made of this tempest of tears, this upland of inconsolable jubilation? In all our lifetimes, finally, this towering, undulating moment is here. I think Finney's poem reminds us of the responsibility that we all share at this undulating, unprecedented moment in American history. We are not free to go on as if nothing happened. Soon it will be just us again, left to answer the great day's question, who are we now? And what do we want to become? Battered and beleaguered, I think our public schools remain our central institution for working on the answers. The next step is to bring our future citizens into the conversation by welcoming our most fervent differences into the classroom, so our children decide what they want America to be. Thanks a lot.